Hello, everybody. Welcome to Church at Home with Rachel for today's Thursday, the 27th of March. I hope you're doing well. We are almost through the month of March, and we'll see what happens when it goes out. Will it go out like a lion because it came in like a lamb? We'll see what happens. I'm back a couple of months ago. I was reading from Common Prayer, a liturgy for ordinary people, and on January 5th, this is what it was commemorating, talking about. Said Martin Luther, an Augustinian monk and biblical scholar, wrote against the Church's use of indulgences and insisted that salvation is a free gift from God, not achieved through good works. Luther refused to recant his criticism of the Church, saying, "Here I stand, I cannot do otherwise." He was excommunicated by Pope Leo X on January 3rd, 1521, and unwittingly becoming the leader of a movement that would later be named the Great Reformation. Here I stand, I cannot do otherwise. I really appreciate Martin Luther's statement, "Here I stand, I cannot do otherwise." I don't know whether it's my age. I'm 53 years old, coming up in a few months on my birthday. Just over a year into being a bishop, and a whole different role, a whole different way of thinking about leadership and who I am and what I'm called to do. Could be the world we're living in, the politics, the craziness, the war in Ukraine, all of these things. But I keep thinking more and more about the need to be mature enough to know where you stand, to be able to say, this is what I stand for, and I won't be moved. Not because we're being stubborn, not because we're just being obstinate, but because we've actually done the work of thinking about those things that are powerful to us, those things that are so meaningful that we aren't going to just change our minds. In the church, for instance, there have been lots of things that have caused schism in the church. I'm thinking even in the time that I have been ordained, like prior to me being ordained, years and years before that, women being ordained caused schism in the church in Canada. I'll speak only to the church in Canada. That's where I live and work and worship and have my being, so I can only speak to them, to our context. I think back to when I was first ordained and the work that was being done in light of the Indian residential schools, the recognition of the nature of the role of the church, what the church did in collusion with the government, what the church did not so much in collusion with the government, but because the government said, here, you do this, and the church did. Um, some things we discovered that the church was hideous, did horrible things, and some things we discovered the church didn't make mistakes in the context that was happening. That there were places where children were treated well, not many, but there were places where children did feel loved and they did learn and things like that. Does that make any? There's no excuse for removing people's culture or their language or stealing away from their families. Of course not. But when I was ordained in 1999, I sort of entered into a time when the church in Canada was being the lawsuits because of the Indian residential schools were happening, and that was a really difficult time to be a priest because we acknowledge that we have done something wrong. Our primates had previous to that point said we acknowledge we did wrong and we apologize. Now we have to live into our apology. And so becoming a priest in that time was fraught with the people arguing, like literally in my congregation saying, we need to stand up and we need to do more and we need to show that we were wrong, and other people saying, absolutely not, we didn't do anything wrong, that was ancestors before us, generations before us, we today did nothing wrong. Go ahead a few more years and we start talking about LGBTQ, and even at that point it wasn't referred to that as that. It was gay marriage, and those people who were in committed relationships, who happened to be the same gender, whether or not they could receive the blessing of their civil marriage within the church. Keep on trucking after that, and then we come up to the conversation about whether or not there can be a marriage, an actual marriage in the church of people of same gender. And now we're talking about liturgies and rituals around people who are trans. We have the recognition that we have the church splitting. Just before I was ordained and following into the early years, in particular, the Anglican Church of Canada watched as groups were pulling away from ANIC and um, I can't remember what it's called, Anglican Church of North America, things like that. And so schism has been happening. It's probably, if we look deep enough, happened every year, everywhere, from time immemorial. But in the 1500s, when Martin Luther was doing his thing in 1521, when he was excommunicated by Pope Leo X, and he said, he stood, "Here I stand, I cannot do otherwise." It was because he had done the work of considering, thinking about, how do I feel about this? How do I pray about this? How do I interpret what God is saying to me about the church? And then he stepped out in faith to do what he believed that God was calling him to do. And hence began the change of the church as the people knew it. And we end up with, like, short story, long story short, we end up with multi-denominations. Instead of the church, we have the Roman Catholic Church, eventually the Anglican Church, the Anabaptists, the Baptists, the Presbyterians, the eventually the United Church, the Methodist Church, all of these different churches, Lutheran Church, and it's different, Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church, all of these different places, not because Martin Luther stood up and said, "Here I stand, I cannot do otherwise," but because someone had the courage in different places, because it wasn't only in England this is what happening, the English Reformation, in Germany with Luther, all these around the world at different places, especially in Europe, at almost the same time, within that generation, within a couple of decades, we see people standing up and saying the same thing in their own context. And that hasn't changed. We have now MAID in Canada, medical assistance in dying, and things like that, which people have strong opinions about. And I don't think they have these strong opinions because they're simply being stubborn or obstinate. I believe people have strong opinions because they've done the work, in most cases, of thinking about it, of praying about it, of holding it in their heart and saying, "I cannot agree to this," or "I can only agree to this. I think this is right." And how do we work in a world where people can hold both of those things? People can legitimately say, "The here I stand, I cannot do otherwise." Not that I'm choosing not to, but I absolutely cannot do otherwise. How I believe is what I believe, and I will not trample that belief. That makes it a very difficult place sometimes to have conversations, doesn't it? How many of us have had difficulties in our own families or in our workplaces where there is somebody who absolutely 100% believes something that we 100% believe is all hooey, and vice versa? I think what we need to really pay attention to isn't so much what other people believe in, but looking at them and doing the deep dive, and looking at our own selves and doing that deep dive to say, do they absolutely do have is this something to which they have no choice? "Here I stand, I cannot do otherwise." Is this really where they are? Because I think if we actually looked at another person and said and heard them say, "Here I stand, I cannot do otherwise," and we acknowledge that and we recognize that and we accept that, what are we going to do? Beat them up because they don't? Like, this is where they stand. This is where they absolutely believe that they are founded on truth. That if, rather than yelling at them or fighting against them about what it is they believe to be true, what if we acknowledged what they thought and honored what they thought and said, "Okay, I'm not going to try to move you. There you stand and you cannot do otherwise? Okay. I can't stand beside you. I can't do that. But here I will stand and I cannot do otherwise." That does not eliminate the possibility of conversation. It doesn't take away the possibility that we can learn from the other person. That the things that they believe, absolutely, maybe we've never been exposed to them, and maybe that if we learn from them, if we hear what made them be so intractable in what they believe, it may not change how we feel, but at least help us to understand how they do. and vice versa. So as I think about that in this world we're living in, and the point I am in my life where I'm coming to that place where I am feeling comfortable in myself to begin to say, here I am, here I stand, I cannot do otherwise. I need to own that for myself, but I also need to have the maturity that I can acknowledge that someone else owns it for themselves as well, even if where they stand is not where I do. I think that our whole world right now is called to a new maturity level where we can own our own stance, but we can also allow other people to own their own as well, and give them as much credit as we give ourselves for having done the homework, having done the prayer, having done the questioning, the doubting, the wondering, to come to where we are to say, this is where I stand. Or as some people would say, this is the ditch I will die in. This is what I will defend. This is where I will be found. There's nothing wrong with that. What becomes wrong with it is when we tell someone else that there's something wrong with them for it. Own your stance and own it with integrity. Have a great day. God bless you, and I will see you again soon for Church at Home with Rachel.